I'm Neil Currant, and this is my virtual conference presentation, and I want to look at variety versus familiarity in practice in assessment task type in higher education. So an assessment task type is, at university, we have a real freedom to set the range of different tasks, and there are all sorts of examples there on the screen: multi-choice questions, exams, essays, lab reports. It's almost as if the list is endless. But is that variety a good thing? And so there's a tension between having a variety of tasks versus being familiar and being able to practice the same assessment task types. So if we look in the literature at some of the arguments for having familiar assessment task types, is this idea that Phil Race talks about the need to practice and they need to be familiar with assessment types to do well, which is what the Tester project talks about. There's also the idea which Graham Gibbs talks about is feed-forward and linked assignments. In other words, students get feedback that they can immediately apply to the next task, and there needs to be some familiarity and similarity in the task type to be able to do that. On the other hand, we have arguments for a variety of assessment tasks, particularly on inclusive education, and where we want multiple means of expression so that we allow students to demonstrate what they know best and the learning outcomes in the way that suits them. So in other words, we have to try and get this balance between having too many task types that results in confusion and means that students don't do well because they just don't understand the different tasks, versus having too much of the same type of task, for example, an essay, which disadvantages certain students who perform better at other types of task. So my context for this investigation are two modules. Module, which I call Module X, has 2 assignments, and the focus there is on variety. One of those assignments is multimedia, and one is a more traditional essay. Module Y, one of its assignments is in 3 parts, and so the focus there is on familiarity, practice, and having the same task type. So when I look at the data for Module X, the variety, there's a significant correlation between performance on both assignments. So we'd expect a good student to do well in both assignments, and that's there. However, when we look at the multimedia assignment, and this is the one that's offering us that variety from the more traditional essay, 21 students did better by 1 grade boundary or more on that assignment, and they averaged, those 21 students, 13.3 marks higher on the multimedia assignment, versus 14 students who did better by a grade boundary on the essay, and their average was lower, 11.8 marks. And actually also I analysed the fact that the profile for each assignment was roughly the same, so the marks given overall for each assignment were roughly the same, so it wasn't due to the multimedia assignment having higher marks overall. And so reflecting on that and reflecting on informal feedback and my observations on the module, the multimedia assignment was really enjoyable to mark, and it really generated some fantastically creative work. Students really seemed to engage with the task, although they found it difficult at times to use some of the multimedia, and some were more conservative than others. No student complained about that variety in either formal or informal feedbacks. That's really positive. And I think importantly, the multimedia assignment helped develop students' digital literacy. They were using audio, they were using video in some cases, which they hadn't done before. And there was also a draft element, so they could get formative feedback. And those students that used formative feedback actually did produce generally better assignments. In one case, a student went from failing to getting a distinction. So my conclusions about that module and variety is that if 30% of students did better by 1 grade boundary or more on one assignment compared to the other, it does seem to suggest that variety in assessment type is actually important so as not to disadvantage certain students. And given that on that module more students gained from having that multimedia assignment, that variety, than what the students who lost by not having 2 written assignments, suggests to me that keeping that variety is actually valuable in that module. Now if I look at the other module, Module Y, the one focusing on familiarity and practice, just a caveat here, only the first 2 of 3 parts have been done. So what happens is Part A is marked, students are given feedback that can be directly used in Part B. And so we see that 11 students did better on Part B than A, and only 3 did worse. And those that did worse had all achieved a distinction anyway on Part A, so they didn't have a lot further to go in terms of improvement. And we look particularly if where the student's mark was below 70% or more, those students improved by nearly 8 marks. Whereas for those students who had already got a distinction, there really wasn't very much of an improvement between A and B. So linked assignments most benefited students who had lower marks, and that makes sense, and those are the students we actually want to help improve. Certain students I noticed, particularly from less experienced or some art and design background, struggled a bit with the academic writing component. And what I also noticed, it was obvious when I marked Part B, that most of the students had attended to the feedback they got from Part A and had tried to address that feedback in Part B. And I think that explains a lot why they got better marks, particularly the students at the lower mark end. So I'm really now convinced on the basis of that the idea of linked assignments has been beneficial to the students in module, and keep this idea. And I have to admit, I wasn't convinced at the start. I really wasn't sure how this was going to work out. So the implications for me is that familiarity works, and I think that's most notably because of feedback, but also variety is beneficial. So there needs to be a design, modules and courses to include both elements. But what also came out of this, which I wasn't quite expecting, is this evaluation highlighted the huge importance of feedback in this whole assessment process. So for my actions that I recommend then, to maintain and encourage the use of drafts and formative feedback on Module X, the one with the variety, so that students have that opportunity to practice and get feedback and improve. And with Module Y, the one focusing on the linked assignments, is greater use of different media, so there's greater means of representation, particularly for those who find the more academic writing more challenging. And there are my references. Thank you.